The room was loud, not the kind of loud that comes from music or noise, the kind that comes from people who think they already know how the story ends. It was a gym, nothing fancy. Metal chairs pushed to the side, mats rolled out on the floor, and the smell of sweat mixed with old wood. People had gathered there because word had spread fast. A woman, known across the wrestling circuit for flattening grown men twice her size, had said something nobody expected her to say. She said Bruce Lee was overrated. Not in private, not in a quiet conversation between friends. She said it out loud, in front of cameras, in front of fighters, in front of people who had spent their whole lives training under men who idolized him. "He's fast, sure," she said, arms crossed, chin lifted like she was daring someone to disagree. But speed doesn't mean anything against real strength, real grappling, real power. Put him in a room with me, and let's see how fast he moves when he can't dance around and has to actually fight. The room went quiet for a second. Then someone laughed. Then more people laughed. Because it sounded ridiculous, almost like a joke nobody was supposed to take seriously. But she wasn't joking. She had a reason to be confident. In her world, she had never lost, not once. She had thrown down men built like tanks, pinned them in seconds, made them tap out before they even understood what happened. To her, size and technique in a controlled ring meant everything. And to her, everything she had heard about Bruce Lee sounded like performance, flashy movement, fast hands. Good for a movie screen, maybe, but not for a real fight, where things get messy, where people grab and twist and slam. She had never actually seen him fight in person. That part mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Word of what she said didn't stay in that gym. It spread the way things spread in those days, through phone calls, through whispers, through people repeating it at other gyms, other dojos, other rings. By the time it reached Bruce Lee, it wasn't just a comment anymore. It had turned into a challenge, a public one. The kind that's hard to walk away from, even if you wanted to. Most people expected him to react the way fighters usually react when they're insulted. Anger, a sharp comeback, maybe even a public statement putting her in her place with words before anything physical ever happened. He didn't do any of that. When someone finally told him what she'd said, word for word, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't even seem surprised. He just looked at the person telling him the story, and after a pause, he said something so simple it almost felt like nothing at all. "Prove it." 2 words. That was it. No anger behind them, no ego, just a quiet invitation, like he was handing her exactly what she asked for and waiting to see what she'd do with it. That response spread just as fast as her original comment did, and it changed the entire tone of the story. Because now it wasn't just a wrestler mocking a martial artist from a distance. It was 2 people from 2 completely different worlds being pulled toward the same room. People started taking sides almost immediately. Wrestling fans backed her, certain that once things turned into real grappling, speed wouldn't matter at all. Martial arts fans backed him, convinced that nobody who had truly seen him move in person ever doubted him twice. But underneath all the noise, both of them were dealing with something a lot more personal than public opinion. For her, this wasn't really about Bruce Lee at all. It was about proving, once again, that everything she'd built, her strength, her instincts, her years of being underestimated just because she was a woman in a sport dominated by men, actually meant something. She had spent her whole career fighting to be taken seriously. This felt like one more mountain to climb, one more name to add to the list of people she'd beaten. For him, it wasn't about ego either. Those who knew him well understood that he rarely fought to prove a point to the world. He fought to test himself, to see where his limits actually were, not where people assumed they were. A challenge like this wasn't an insult to brush off. It was an opportunity, a real one, something rare, because most people were too afraid to ever stand in front of him and mean it. Neither of them fully understood at that moment how far this was about to go. Neither of them knew that this wasn't just going to be a story told in that gym or repeated in a few phone calls. It was going to be something people would still be talking about years later, long after the room had emptied and the noise had faded. But before any of that could happen, before the two of them would ever stand across from each other, there was something people on both sides needed to understand. They didn't actually know who they were dealing with. Not really. Because behind the calm two-word answer Bruce Lee gave that day, there was a story most people never bothered to learn. A story about discipline, obsession, and a mind that worked completely differently from anyone else in that room. And that story is where everything truly begins. To understand why Bruce Lee answered that challenge with two calm words instead of anger, you have to go back further than that gym, further than the rumors, further than the wrestling circuit entirely. You have to go back to a skinny kid in Hong Kong who couldn't stop getting into fights. That part surprises people. The image most folks carry of Bruce Lee is the finished version. The lightning-fast hands, the controlled power, the presence that filled a screen without him even needing to say much. But that version didn't start out that way. He started out as a kid with too much energy, too much pride, and not nearly enough discipline to back it up. He grew up in the streets of Hong Kong during a time when fighting wasn't just common, it was survival. Gangs of teenagers claimed corners and alleys the way older men claimed territory. Bruce Lee wasn't the biggest kid, wasn't the strongest, but he had something else that made up for it. He refused to lose. Not because he was naturally gifted, because he hated the feeling of being beaten more than he feared getting hurt trying to avoid it. His parents worried. A kid who keeps coming home with bruises and torn clothes isn't exactly reassuring. So they pushed him towards something that might channel all that restless energy into a discipline instead of a habit. That's when he found Wing Chun, and more importantly, a teacher who saw something in him worth shaping. Most kids learn a martial art and treat it like a hobby. Bruce Lee treated it like a puzzle he needed to solve completely. He didn't just want to know the moves. He wanted to understand why they worked. Why a smaller person could overpower someone twice their size if the angle was right. Why timing beat raw power more often than people assumed. Why hesitation, even for half a second, could cost you everything in a real fight. This is the part most people miss when they picture him as just the fast guy. He wasn't fast because he was naturally gifted with lightning reflexes. He trained his reflexes obsessively, over and over, until speed simply became a habit his body carried without thinking. There's a difference between someone born fast and someone who made themselves fast through repetition. Most people would find unbearable. When he eventually moved to the United States, he didn't slow down. If anything, he pushed harder. He wasn't content sticking to one style. Traditional martial arts, at the time, were built around rigid systems. You learn a form, you master it, you stay loyal to it. Bruce Lee thought that mindset was a trap. He believed styles were tools, not religions. If something worked, you kept it. If it didn't work in a real situation, you threw it away, no matter how traditional it was supposed to be. That idea eventually became the foundation of everything he built afterward, a way of fighting that borrowed from boxing footwork, fencing distance, wrestling awareness, and traditional kung fu discipline blended into something that didn't look like anything else at the time. People who trained with him described it as fighting someone who never did the same thing twice. You couldn't predict him because he refused to be predictable on purpose. But here's the part that connects directly to that gym, to that challenge, to the calm way he responded to a stranger mocking him in public. Bruce Lee trained obsessively against exactly the kind of doubt that wrestler was throwing at him. Early in his career, plenty of people questioned whether his style would hold up against grapplers, boxers, wrestlers, anyone who fought differently than the traditional kung fu he represented. Instead of getting defensive about it, he leaned directly into the discomfort. He studied wrestling. He studied grappling exchanges. He wanted to know exactly what would happen if someone tried to close distance and take him to the ground, because he understood something most fighters at the time refused to admit. No single style is complete on its own. That's why prove it wasn't arrogance. It wasn't a man assuming he'd win without a second thought. It was the response of someone who had already spent years preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Not this specific wrestler, not this specific gym, but the concept of being doubted by someone who fought completely differently than he did. He wasn't afraid of grappling. He respected it. He just didn't believe raw strength alone could solve every problem in a fight, and he was fully prepared to demonstrate why. There was also something deeper driving him, something that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong. Bruce Lee genuinely believed that growth only happens at the edge of fear. Comfortable training against people who already agreed with your style teaches you nothing new. But standing across from someone who thinks you're going to lose, someone who has real skill and real confidence backing up that belief, that's where truth gets revealed. Not opinions, not internet arguments, truth. So when he heard what the wrestler said about him, some part of him welcomed it. Not because he wanted to embarrass her, but because he wanted to see, honestly and without ego, whether everything he had built over years of obsessive training could hold up against someone who had never lost a real fight either. Meanwhile, across town, the wrestler who started all of this had no idea just how deliberately prepared the man she challenged actually was. She had her own story, her own reasons for believing she couldn't lose, and that story is just as important as his. Section 3. The Woman Who Feared Nothing. If you had asked anyone in the wrestling circuit to describe her in one word, they would have all landed on the same one: unstoppable. She hadn't gotten there by luck. Nobody hands a woman that reputation in a sport built on brute force and dominance. She had earned it the hard way, one match at a time, against opponents who underestimated her right up until the moment she had them pinned to the mat. Her story didn't start in some polished training academy with perfect equipment and encouraging coaches. It started in a much rougher place, small-town gyms where she was often the only woman in the room, surrounded by men who assumed she was there to watch, not compete. The first few times she stepped onto the mat, she heard the same thing over and over. "This isn't really for you. Maybe try something else. You'll get hurt." She didn't argue with any of them. She just kept showing up. That became the pattern of her entire career. People doubted her before matches. She proved them wrong during them. It happened so many times that eventually, the doubt stopped coming from strangers and started coming from something more personal. The fear that if she ever slowed down, if she ever let herself feel comfortable, all those old voices telling her she didn't belong would turn out to be right after all. So she trained like someone who had something to prove every single day, even after there was nothing left to prove. While other wrestlers treated their sport as something you clocked in and out of, she treated it like a war she couldn't afford to lose. Early mornings, late nights, sparring against men far heavier than her, not because she had something to prove to them specifically, but because if she could handle their weight and strength, nothing in a real match would ever surprise her. Her specialty wasn't speed, it wasn't flash, it was control. She had an instinct for closing distance, wrapping an opponent up before they even realized how close she'd gotten, and using leverage instead of raw muscle to bring people twice her size down to the mat. Once she had someone there, in her world, the fight was already over. Ground control was her language, and she spoke it better than almost anyone else in her weight class, sometimes better than people well above it. That confidence didn't come from arrogance. It came from evidence. Match after match, she had walked in as the underdog and walked out as the one with her hand raised. She had beaten fighters who trained twice as long as she had. She had beaten fighters who outweighed her by 50, 60 pounds. Somewhere along the way, underestimated stopped being an insult and started being an advantage. People walked into a match with her already thinking they had it won, and that mistake cost them almost every time. So when she looked at what she knew about Bruce Lee, mostly through stories, demonstrations, and secondhand accounts, since she'd never actually stood across from him, she filtered it all through the only lens she trusted: the mat. And on the mat, in her experience, speed and sharp technique only mattered until someone closed the distance and took the fight to the ground. Once that happened, technique gave way to strength, control, and the kind of grinding pressure that broke people down no matter how fast their hands were. She wasn't trying to be cruel when she said what she said publicly. In her mind, she was simply being honest about something she deeply believed, based on years of first-hand experience beating fighters who relied on speed and striking. To her, it wasn't disrespect. It was pattern recognition. Every fast, flashy striker she had ever faced eventually ended up on the mat, and once they were there, the outcome was rarely close. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, since she'd never seen him move in person, was that Bruce Lee had spent years specifically preparing for fighters who thought exactly the way she did. He didn't dismiss grappling as a threat. He respected it enough to study it, to understand where his own style would break down if he wasn't careful, and to close those gaps deliberately, long before this challenge ever became public. Neither of them fully understood the other's world. That's often how these moments happen. Two people, each excellent within the boundaries of what they know, absolutely certain that their experience represents the whole truth about how a real fight works. When she first heard how he responded to her comment, just those two words, "prove it," delivered without anger or theatrics, something shifted in her. Not doubt exactly. She wasn't the type to doubt herself easily, but a kind of sharpened attention. The kind you get when you realize the person you're about to face isn't reacting the way everyone else usually did. Most people got defensive. Most people tried to argue back publicly, list their accomplishments, remind everyone why they shouldn't be doubted. He didn't do any of that. He just accepted. And in her world, the fighters who accepted a challenge that calmly, without needing to convince anyone of anything first, were usually the ones who knew exactly what they were capable of. For the first time since this whole thing started, she allowed herself one quiet thought she hadn't said out loud to anyone. Maybe this wouldn't be as easy as she assumed. But by then, it was already too late to back out. The date was set. The room was chosen. And soon, Both of them would stop being stories other people told about them and start being two people standing across from each other, with nothing left to say and everything left to prove. The day finally arrived, and by then, it wasn't really a secret anymore. Word had traveled far enough that people showed up who had no real connection to either of them, just curious, just wanting to witness whatever was about to happen with their own eyes instead of hearing about it secondhand. The space they chose wasn't a stage. There were no ropes, no bright lights, no announcer building up the moment with a dramatic voice. It was a plain training room, mats laid out across the floor, chairs pushed against the walls for the handful of people allowed to watch. She arrived first, calm on the outside, the way she always was before a match, though anyone who knew her well could see the extra focus in her eyes. She stretched slowly, rolled her shoulders, and kept glancing toward the door every few minutes without meaning to. When he walked in, the room noticeably shifted. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't make an entrance. He walked in wearing simple training clothes, said a quiet hello to a few familiar faces, and began loosening up in the corner like this was any other day. But there was something about the way he moved, controlled, deliberate, completely present, that made the room quieter without anyone asking it to be. The two of them finally stood across from each other in the center of the mats. For a moment, neither spoke. It was the kind of silence that says more than words could. She studied him the way she studied every opponent, looking for tension in the shoulders, weight distribution, anything that might tell her how he'd react once she closed the distance. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed, she thought. Almost like he wasn't taking this seriously. She didn't know yet that his stillness wasn't relaxation. It was readiness. Someone gave a signal to begin, simple and unceremonious, and the room held its breath. She moved first, just like she always did. Her strategy had worked on dozens of fighters before him. Close the distance fast, get inside where striking range didn't matter anymore, and use her hips and leverage to bring the fight to the ground where she was unbeatable. She was fast, faster than most people expected from someone her size. But the moment she stepped in, he was already gone from where she expected him to be. Not far, not dramatically, just enough. A small shift of his hips, a redirect of her momentum instead of a clash against it, and suddenly her forward motion carried her slightly off balance instead of connecting the way she planned. It wasn't a strike. It wasn't even really a counter. It was almost nothing. And that nothing was exactly the point. She reset immediately, adjusting, coming in again with more control this time, trying to change the angle so he couldn't slip away as easily. This time, she got closer, close enough to reach for a grip, close enough to feel like her plan was finally starting to work. But the instant her hands made contact, something changed. He didn't fight her strength directly. He never tried to overpower the grip the way most strikers instinctively would. Instead, he used the smallest amount of resistance necessary, redirecting the energy of her own pull, turning her forward momentum into something she suddenly had to fight to control rather than something working in her favor. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something unfamiliar in a match: hesitation. Not fear exactly, just the sudden, sharp awareness that the fighter in front of her wasn't reacting to her the way everyone else always had. He wasn't trying to overpower her. He was trying to understand her, in real time, adjusting with every single exchange, like he was solving a puzzle that revealed a new piece every time she moved. The people watching from the edges of the mat had gone completely silent. No cheering, no gasping, no reactions loud enough to interrupt what was happening. Everyone in that room understood, almost instinctively, that they weren't just watching two fighters test each other. They were watching two completely different philosophies of fighting collide in real time. Pressure and control against speed and adaptability, and neither one was backing down. She tried one more time, going for the takedown that had worked on nearly everyone she'd ever faced, committing fully this time instead of testing the water. And for a brief moment, it looked like it might actually work. But in the space of that single exchange, something happened that would end up being talked about long after that day was over. Not because of a dramatic knockout, not because of a broken record or a shocking injury, but because of something far more revealing. Bruce Lee didn't need to overpower her to prove his point. He needed to show her something she hadn't fully considered before stepping onto that mat. And in the seconds that followed, that's exactly what happened. As she committed to the takedown, driving forward with everything she had, Bruce Lee did something that caught almost everyone in that room off guard. He didn't resist her strength head-on, and he didn't try to overpower the pull of her grip. He simply moved with her. For a split second, it looked like her plan was working exactly the way it always had. Like she was about to bring him down the same way she'd brought down every other fighter who ever doubted her ground game. But instead of fighting the fall, he used the motion itself, shifting his
turning
base
what
at the
should have
last
been her
possible
advantage
moment
into a position where neither of them had full control.
They ended up on the mat together, not because he was beaten there, but because he chose to go there with her, on terms that weren't entirely hers anymore. What happened in the next few seconds is the part people still talk about. Not because of some dramatic, cinematic finish, because of how ordinary it looked, and how much that ordinary moment actually said. On the ground, in the space where she believed no striker could ever compete with her, Bruce Lee didn't panic. He didn't try to scramble back to his feet the way most strikers instinctively do when a fight hits the floor. He stayed calm, used tight, controlled movements to prevent her from ever fully securing the position she needed, and slowly, patiently, worked his way back to a stance where distance mattered again. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't the kind of moment you'd see highlighted in a movie trailer. But everyone watching understood exactly what it meant. He hadn't just prepared to strike. He had prepared for exactly this. For someone confident enough to take him to the ground, strong enough to control the position, and skilled enough that most fighters wouldn't have survived it. And he survived it. Calmly, without ever needing to prove a point through force. When they both eventually stood back up, breathing hard, sweat on both their faces, something in the room had shifted. It wasn't declared with an announcement. Nobody raised a hand in victory. There was no official winner in the way people usually expect from these stories. But everyone who watched it happen understood something clearly that day. She had come in believing that speed and technique would fall apart the moment a real fight hit the ground. What she witnessed instead was someone who had already thought that far ahead. Someone who didn't just train to strike fast, but trained to survive every version of a fight, including the one type of fight he was supposedly weakest at. For her, that moment mattered more than most people realized. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't angry either. If anything, something in her respected him more after that exchange than before it. Because he hadn't tried to humiliate her or prove some grand point about who was better. He had simply shown up, matched her intensity, and revealed the gap between assumption and reality without needing to say a single word about it. For him, it confirmed something he already believed deeply: that real skill isn't about mastering one style so completely that you never need anything else. It's about understanding your own weaknesses honestly enough to prepare for them, instead of pretending they don't exist. Afterward, according to people who were close to both of them, there wasn't any tension between them. No rivalry that lingered, no bitterness carried forward. Just a quiet kind of mutual respect that only forms after two people test each other completely, with nothing held back, and walk away from it with a clearer understanding of themselves. The story spread the way these things always do: retold, reshaped, sometimes exaggerated with each retelling, until pieces of it start sounding more like legend than memory. That's often what happens to moments like this over time. The exact details blur, but the core of it stays the same. Because the core of it was never really about who technically won that day. It was about what happens when someone is underestimated. And instead of getting angry about it, they simply show up and let their preparation speak for itself. It was about what happens when confidence meets humility in the same room. Not two people trying to destroy each other, but two people trying to find out the truth about themselves, using each other as the only honest measuring stick either of them had left. And maybe that's why this story has lasted as long as it has. Not because of a clean, dramatic ending. Not because someone got knocked out or embarrassed in front of a crowd. But because it captures something most people quietly understand about their own lives: the fear of being tested, the temptation to avoid a real challenge, and the quiet respect that comes from finally facing it anyway. Bruce Lee didn't need to say, "I told you so." He didn't need validation from anyone in that room. He had already gotten what he actually wanted the moment he agreed to step onto that mat. The truth, tested honestly, without excuses on either side. And in the end, that's really what the whole story was always about. Not proving someone wrong, just proving something real.